Hey everyone. I got a few requests for some tutorial videos, so I figured I'd do one on the techniques that I use for drawing hands. It probably goes without saying, but this is just the way I do hands and might not be what works best for you. I've been drawing long enough that the basics are almost automatic, so when I do hands I tend to just draw based on muscle memory. So you can see in this clip here I give a blobby outline for where I want the hand to go, and then I freehand fingers and the other details from there. Some poses are a little more exaggerated and I need more of a skeleton to keep it in line, like this drawing here. In my first sketch, I throw down a basic skeleton and then go back over and correct it a bit before coming back in with the final detail. This kind of instinctual placement of the parts of the hand comes with practice, and I would definitely suggest drawing from reference to start, and even continue to draw from reference as you improve. Even the best artists require practice, and a great way to get that practice is to draw from reference. You can use pictures from Google for reference, you can look at a mirror, you can take selfies. I tend to just hold my hand up next to drawing and look back and forth and catch the details from my hand right next to me. But sometimes it'll require you to grab a reference image from online because there's some poses that you just can't get a good angle of by yourself. And sometimes it also helps to have someone nearby who's willing to model for you. So there have been times I've been drawing, like my brother's hanging out, and I ask him to hold up his hand in a certain way, and I use that as my reference. Whichever way you get a hold of your reference, it's a really solid practice for memorizing the basics. We can discuss techniques for drawing from reference in a future video if that's something everyone's interested in, but for now, let's do a drawing where we break down a hand into its basic parts. We'll start with the palm side of the hand. First off, we have the palm itself, which I usually represent with a square, slightly tapered towards the top. Next we have the fingers, which I've seen done a few ways, like the fan shape or overlapping ovals, but we're going to use the method that I was taught. Each finger is a stack of 3 rectangles with an oval representing the first knuckle. Moving on to the thumb, we have a large oval representing the muscle attached to the base of the thumb, followed by a circle representing the first knuckle of the thumb, and then a short rectangle and a tapered rectangle. And that second tapered rectangle is the tip of the thumb, so it's wider at the base closer to the palm and then slowly tapers down, not to a point, but it's kind of rounded. From here, you can add defining details like the fold in the palm below the fingers, the muscle opposite the thumb, and the curve down into the wrist. And now I'll just clean up my lines a little bit. When I'm cleaning up a sketch, I usually drop the opacity down on the sketch layer, add a new layer, and then I use a liner brush to clean up all my lines. Now let's try one that looks a little bit more natural. When I draw hands, I tend to try and avoid flat, perfectly straight-fingered poses. Bending the fingers and tilting the hand can help make a hand pose look more organic. And we'll do a second one with the steps that I outlined before. Here are a few things to keep in mind in regards to proportions. The thumb is usually either even with or extends a little past the base of the pointer finger when extended upwards. And with the fingers, I usually make that first knuckle a bit wider than the rest of the finger, and then taper it in at the second knuckle. This can be used to show age. For example, if you're drawing an old man, you can have his fingers look like this, which is fine. But if you exaggerate the size of the knuckles, it'll give them an arthritic appearance, really completing the look. You can also go the other way and have a younger or more delicate character have perfectly tapered fingers. Now let's try that out from start to finish. So you can see here I'm adding in the fingers and the thumb, going down into the wrist, and then cleaning up my line work. And in this example I'm actually going to do full color on. So I'm going through and closing all my shapes. And what that means is I'm basically just making sure there's no gaps in the edge, because when I do color, I select everything inside the lines and then I drop my mid-tone into that space and just do my shading on that. It just makes less work. And here I've added a solid shading layer for the darkest part, and then I've used an airbrush to do the rest of my shading and my highlights. And that's it for the palm side example. Now we're going to move on to the back of the hand. This will start similarly to the palm with a tapered square. From there, we're going to add the knuckles. I like to use these egg-like shapes, but you could use plain ovals or circles if you wanted. I just prefer to use this shape because it kind of mimics the shape of the knuckle, and then that bottom point shows where the tendons are going to stand out on the back of the hand. Next, we copy the palm side again and add rectangles for the fingers, with the first knuckle represented by a squashed oval. And again, I do this just because I like to exaggerate that first knuckle, because most of the time when I'm drawing, it's either I'm drawing like a nasty monster and it's going to have big swollen first knuckle joints, or I'm drawing like an old grizzled warrior, and in both cases I prefer to exaggerate that first knuckle. You don't have to, and in fact it's better to decide whether or not you're going to do it based on what you're drawing. And each of these rectangles should be about the same length within the same finger. Obviously the pinky is shorter than the middle finger is longer than the pointer finger, but inside each finger you want each of those rectangles to be the same length. After that, we're going to move down to the thumb, using a rounded wedge for the knuckles and 2 rectangles for the joints. The second rectangle will be more of a trapezoid tapering into the tip, just like last time. And after that, we'll chisel out the other details, like an oval for the wrist bone, defining the muscle on the outside of the palm and tapering it up to the pinky, drawing the tendons on the back of the hand, and adding the fingernails. We'll get into the finer details on our next sketch. And now let's try another pose to display the back of the hand. Here we're going to have the fingers angling downwards, with the knuckles closer to us than the wrist, so that first square will be tapered in the opposite direction due to foreshortening. And here I am adding the egg shapes to represent the knuckles. And now we're going to add in those rectangles to represent the fingers, with the oval to represent that first knuckle. We have the fingers curved, giving the hand the appearance of resting on a knee or maybe the armrest of a chair. And it's always good to keep in your mind what your subject is doing. It's going to help us imagine the pose for this hand if we're imagining it draped over something like that. And here I am adding the forearm, and then the thumb, and fingernails. Here are a few tips to remember for the back of the hand. The fingernails usually start about halfway up the last joint and end at the tip of the finger. This isn't always the case though, and we can shorten it to show that our subject bites their nails, or lengthen the nails to give a more manicured appearance. When drawing knuckles, they don't always have to protrude from the back of the hand like they do in this picture here. In some cases, there might be a dimple over that knuckle instead. For example, if the person you're drawing is heavier set or younger. Try to vary it so you're not always drawing the same hand. Let's look at it from a different angle to illustrate the point. The bones on the back of the hand usually stick out more when clenched because the skin is pulled tightly across them. If we look at the hand when it isn't clenched, we have the ball of the knuckle and a divot between it and the next knuckle. We can show that someone is younger, heavier, or even just more hydrated by decreasing or removing that divot entirely and replacing the protruding knuckle with a dimple. Now let's throw everything we learned about the back of the hand together from start to finish. So here we have the square for the hand, and I'm throwing in those egg shapes and moving up into the fingers with our stacks of 3. Again, curving them slightly because it feels more natural that way. And for the pinky and ring finger, I actually curved them even more to kind of give this pose more of like a reaching feel. And here we are moving down into the detail of the wrist. We've got the little knot, moving down into the forearm a little bit. And I actually noticed that my thumb was a little far back, so I'm going to go in, lasso it, and shift it up towards the fingers more. And now I'm going to drop the opacity down on the sketch layer, make a new layer, and go in and start my line work. And I'm making sure to keep my line work clean, but my first time through, I don't worry about closing the edges as much. Once I get all the line work out, then I'll go around and close my shape so that I can select everything and drop in my base color. And you can see here I'm filling in detail as I go, adding in the wrinkles on the back of the knuckles and adding in fingernails. Your first couple times doing it, I would suggest mapping out all of the detail in your sketch layer before going through with the line work, but I've had enough practice with it that I kind of just add detail as I go. And now I'm going to start closing up all my shapes so I can get a nice clean selection. You don't have to color this way. You could go through with your base color and draw it in the way you do your line work right up to the edge. I just find it saves a lot of time if you just drag and drop your base color in there. If I'm doing more of a painting style, I won't do this. But when it comes to more of a cartoony style or a manga style, I find this a lot easier. And right here I'm just throwing in my fingernail color. At the end of it, I'm actually going to drop the opacity down on this, but I'm leaving it up right now just so I can see where it's at. And then I'm going to grab an airbrush and take like an orangey red and color in the fingertips, the knuckles, and a little bit of the forearm just to add some variation in the skin tone. And now I'm going to drop down the opacity on it so it's not so harsh or vibrant. And I'm going to move into my shading. Just like the last time, I'm going to go through with a liner brush and do my darkest shadows with a hard line, and then I'll drop the opacity down on that, and I'll go through and use an airbrush to do my lightest tone and my second to darkest tone. So with this shading, I'm just kind of blocking out the darkest areas, kind of using it to show more detail. So that's what I'm doing in the wrist here and on the back of the hand, and it makes it to where I can add detail without having as many heavy black lines. And now I'm going to move in my airbrush, just adding in a slightly lighter tone than that dark shading that I added with a slightly higher saturation, again because I don't want the skin to be too uniform. I really like using the airbrush because it blends so well and it kind of feels like I'm sculpting a little bit. It lets me create more of a smooth feel. If I'm making something like stone or dirt or tree bark, I'll use the spray paint brush or any number of other textured things, but for skin I really like this airbrush look. And now I'm going through with the lighter tone and adding my highlights. And the highlights will really pull it into the 3D and show roundness around the edges. Alright, and that's it for the back of the hand example. Now we're going to move into a third drawing and tie everything that we just did together into one image. So here I wanted to display all of our hand techniques that we tested out today. So I'm going to do a creature that's made of hands. And if you've never seen any of my art before, I apologize for the rapid departure into the grotesque. So you can see here I'm doing a variety of different hand poses and different directions. So we're showing front, back, open hand, kind of closed. Got a real gnarled hand in the back there. So I do a lot of these kind of grotesque drawings just for fun, but they're also great practice for doing hands and arms and poses, because you can kind of get away with a lot more. So a lot of my practice with hands and arms really comes from doing these weird twisted monsters. Obviously you don't have to do that to get practice, but it is a great way to do it. Really any subject matter you enjoy you can use for practice. So you might not like monsters, but you might really like comics, so you could find a panel that has your favorite character in a pose that has the hands clearly displayed, and you can recreate that image to get your practice. Alright, and here I am closing up my line work again because I'm about to go in and start doing my color. And the palette I chose for this drawing is mostly yellow, but I'm going to use a grayish green to go through and darken the ends of the fingers and add veins throughout the arms. And the reason I'm adding this darker tone to the fingers is I imagine this creature's probably undead, so it just adds more of a nasty look to it. But now I'm going through and adding my shading to the cloak and the hands protruding out from the hood, and now moving down onto the lower hands and up into the pseudo wings, and adding highlights onto the backs of the hands, which is really going to make those knuckles pop, no pun intended. And here is the final image with a foggy background. I just want to say thanks to anyone that made this far into the video, and I really hope this tutorial helped. Feel free to drop a comment below if you want a tutorial on a different topic. But that's all. I'll see you in the next one.
Jesus wept.